To talk with you about China's military position in the world at the moment, but let's turn to some of our other experts that we spoke with at Great Decisions before coming to this program, see what they have to say first.
With respect to China's military development, which is occurring at a steady and systematic pace, that does not challenge U.S. security per se. It does challenge, or may be seen to challenge, the security of our allies, Japan and South Korea, and our quasi-ally Taiwan. It also involves Chinese military units, particularly air and naval, operating in areas that the U.S. Navy used to see as its monopoly. And it was the forward extension of our forces that gave us a greater sense of security. Now China wants to push out into the same area to improve its security.
I think one of the issues for the Chinese leadership is rising expectations, which is that if you continually talk about how China is becoming a great power and you discuss the Chinese military power, eventually the Chinese people are going to expect you to use it and at least be more assertive or forward-leaning than the Chinese have traditionally been. I think one of the characteristics of the Chinese foreign policy over the last 2 decades has been to let other countries take the lead. And eventually the Chinese people are going to expect China to do more.
China sees the Western Pacific as a place that is kind of more naturally its own than a home to American submarines. And so these issues are going to have to be worked out. And the backdrop is rising Chinese nationalism, which is something that troubles me and I think is going to make it difficult for any Chinese government to try to work through some of these issues.
So let me ask you this simple question. Is China expanding, aggrandizing its military in a way that threatens the United States? David?
Well, I think the basic answer I would give is not necessarily. Whether it does in the future is going to depend on a lot of things, in part the environment that the outside world creates for China. Like Mr. Christoph, I worry about Chinese nationalism. But I think the point that Mr. Bush made is the one I would want to emphasize, and that is traditionally China's military power was based on a land army. When Deng Xiaoping came to office in 1978, China had 4 million roughly in its People's Liberation Army, most land troops, a very weak Navy and Air Force. Deng Xiaoping's approach was to reduce the land army and begin to build the Army, or the Air Force and the Navy. And by definition, that moves into the zones that the United States has traditionally occupied. China essentially began to want to be able to protect its increasing interdependence with the world. It gets, 85% of its oil up through the South China Sea, the Straits of Malacca. It wants to protect those resources, and so it's moved into the world. It's also acquiring the capacity to protect that. I don't think military conflict is inevitable, but I think we have to build some mutual strategic trust if we're to avoid it. And I think that's the core of the challenge that the Obama administration and its successors will face.
You agree, Randy, that it's primarily to protect China's own interests in the Pacific, for example, that is causing it to move in that direction?
Well, I would say it's slightly different. I don't disagree with that comment, but I think some of what's been said by the commentators suggests that this is somehow not a concern for the United States because their capabilities aren't a challenge to us directly, maybe just to our allies and friends. But I think, in fact, if you look at the acquisition strategy and the capability that China is building, much of it is oriented against the United States. And I don't say that in an alarmist way or to try to raise the specter of a coming adversary, but it's just plain fact. If you look at an acquisition strategy that includes anti-satellite weapons, anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles that are also aircraft carrier and ship killers that were all procured after the 95-96 crisis in the Taiwan Strait, much of this is about the United States. Now, defense ministries all over the world prepare for bad outcomes, worst-case scenarios, et cetera. So I sort of come back to the point that the historical definition of threat, or at least we're taught in the military where I came from, is a combination of capability and intent. And so it's that intent side of the equation that is now uncertain and that I think we can shape and work on and prevent this from being a relationship that heads toward conflict. But there's no question in my mind that on the capability side of the equation, there's very robust investment, and much of it is oriented against the United States.
Now, you've had a good deal of military experience. I know there have been numerous efforts over decades, really, to engage in military-to-military cooperative exercises and discussions and so on. It doesn't seem as though much of that has succeeded. Why?
Well, we've talked about the mutual suspicions in the overall relationship. That's at its highest point, I would suggest, in the two ministries of defense and in our militaries. It's also the first part of the relationship that gets sacrificed when political relations sour. We pause or cancel the mill-to-mill aspects of the relationship. And so we've had a couple steps forward and oftentimes not just one step back, but two steps back to the starting point. And so it has been a source of personal disappointment having worked on the military-to-military relationship, but I think most analysts would say we're not anywhere near where we should be in terms of our military-to-military interactions.
David?
Well, I would say a couple things. First, on the capability side, we had to also mention that China's had some impressive achievements in space, launched 3 different manned missions, and that's a whole nother zone of either potential cooperation or contention. So I think that's one thing we have to think about. Also, cyber warfare, which is a whole new dimension, and actually some things happening from China. Whether or not they all have the sanction of the Chinese government is hard to say, but rather disturbing penetrations of our computer systems and so forth. So that's a zone. I would say, though, that I think the Chinese have tried to go to school on the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union basically spent itself into oblivion on the defense side, undermined the support of its people, and scared the rest of the world to the point where we put a lot of pressure on them. I think the Chinese do not want to go down that track, and so they're beginning to try to engage in exchanges, not only with the U.S., that's been somewhat difficult, but with many other countries, many of our allies, countries in Southeast Asia, and so forth. You see the Chinese inviting many of other countries' people to their academies and military schools and so on. So they're trying, on the one hand, to build up their capability, but on the other hand, be reassuring, and that's a very difficult tightrope to walk, and we'll see if they're successful.
Just a footnote on the space thing. I was going to ask you about that anyway. Why is China engaging in that space activity? Is that a military focus? Is it a matter of national pride? Does it have to do with communication technology and the future development of China's infrastructure at home?
Well, really all of the above, actually. It just gives you one example, but there are both military and legitimate civilian, and it's often entangled. One of them was that China was highly dependent on the GPS system of the United States for guidance of aircraft, civilian and military and so forth. Nonetheless, it did not want to be subject to being dependent on a system that ultimately the U.S. controlled. So it's been developing its own GPS system at a rather substantial rate would be one example. But China also has lunar missions planned for scientific exploration for the most part. But China, as we've seen, also developing anti-satellite weapons and so forth. And this is one thing, if you think about it, we cooperated with the Soviet Union in space at the height of the Cold War. We have not been able to cooperate with the Chinese to anywhere near that extent. And one reason is the military and civilian uses of space in the Chinese program, and the role of the Chinese military in their space program is quite